And thanks again for everyone who's patched in, and good morning, afternoon, and evening to wherever you all are joining us from. My name is Sarah Bessel, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Human Trafficking Legal Center. And this is another installment of our series, Voices from the Litigation Frontlines. And just a few housekeeping tips. Please remember that you can ask questions during the presentation in the Q&A box, and you can actually upvote questions that you see and like, so please feel free to do that. As I mentioned, the session will be recorded and sent to attendees and absentees. And so today we are thrilled to be joined by Mustafa Qadri, who is the founder and executive director of Equidem, a human rights and labor rights charity working globally and locally to promote the rights of marginalized communities and seek accountability for serious violations. Mustafa is a human rights research and advocacy expert with 20 years of experience in government and public international law, journalism, and the NGO sector as well. And Mustafa is here today to discuss Equidem's newest report, The Cost of Contagion, and the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on migrant workers in Gulf countries. So Mustafa, we're so excited to hear from you and about your research, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sarah. It's really a pleasure to be here with you today. And thank you to the Center for inviting me to speak about the work that we've been doing. I've been a real admirer of the work that the Center does for a very long time. So it's great to be in touch. And also thank you to everyone who's joining the call and also for your interest in these issues. Really look forward to talking with you after my presentation about any questions or thoughts that you might have. Well, Sarah has introduced who I am, so really I don't need to elaborate on that, but just to say very quickly that Equidem is a new charity, but the work that myself and my colleagues have been doing on the rights of migrant workers and other workers around the world is not new. Myself and other team members have been working for many years, in some cases decades, on these issues. And whilst in many ways we've seen the world change, we've seen positives and negatives. In fact, we've also seen that these issues have remained constant for a very long time. And I know that many of you watching today will probably feel, now with this coronavirus shadow over us, then these are very dark times. And if those issues haven't been changing for a long time, how do we change them now? So whilst today I want to talk a little bit about the work that we've done, some really harrowing cases of exploitation and misery, I also want to hopefully end with some positives about what we can do collectively to address these issues. Firstly, to talk a little bit about Equidem, the charity. So we started off about 4.5 years ago. I started Equidem with literally just a bit of money in my pocket, registered us as a human rights consultancy, and we started working mostly on investigative work, some advisory work with ethical actors. We worked with some of the most ethical investors, trade unions, civil society. We worked with the International Labour Organization, and we also worked with grassroots organizations to document the labor conditions for low-wage workers around the world, and much of that work was in the Gulf. We'd always planned to set up the charity to work in a different way, not to work as providing research support to others, but to actually set our own agenda sometime in the future. And then about a year ago, of course, the pandemic really broke out. And Equidem is a really unique organization because whilst there are experts like myself and others in the team working globally for many years, our team also at its ground level is actually staffed by current and former migrant workers and other low-wage workers who are part of our team. They're not fixers, they're not people that we just hire to give us access. They're really critical parts of the organization. And that was really a central aspect of how we developed the organization, because what we felt firstly was that we wanted to get an intimate understanding of the human beings, the women and men who are suffering in different parts of the world. But we also wanted to make sure that we dealt with often what seems like a disconnect between the international level advocacy and discussion on human trafficking and other labor rights issues, and those at the front line who see what they see every day happening to their family, their friends, their communities. And the other thing we felt also was it was really critical to empower through these people affected communities. So that's a really big part of Equidem. And so, like I was saying, it was the pandemic starting at the beginning of last year, about a year ago, and our staff in the Gulf were being inundated literally with phone calls and meeting with people, talking about how the pandemic was affecting them. And I remember very early on, around about sort of late January, early February, having a number of calls with my colleagues on the ground, and they were really adamant that we needed to do something about it. And initially, I was really feeling like, this is really important. Let's transfer these cases to people that we know to help these workers. But we're not really in a position to say much more than that. But very quickly, what we realized was not just that there was a lot of cases that were very familiar to us, workers that were in starvation because of unpaid wages, workers in situations of modern slavery and forced labor because of their treatment by their employers and others. But what we were seeing was a humanitarian catastrophe. Workers were being left behind, not just because of the physical environment that they were in, but because of the positive actions of governments and employers to prioritize their interests and others at the expense of workers. And so we felt very quickly the need to speak out about this, to go publicly with what we had. And so we spent the next roughly 9 months very carefully documenting cases from the Gulf countries of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar in the Middle East region. And we, in the end, spoke to over 200 workers, women and men, in a range of sectors, mostly low-wage workers. And to make it really clear, this is a qualitative research, but these were very in-depth, one-to-one interviews done in private locations. These were not focus group interviews, but very much rigorous research. And so a lot of effort was put into making sure that we knew very accurately what was happening to these workers. And if you see our report, I can share a link with you to that research. I really encourage you to look at that. But in a nutshell, what we really found was that by virtue of how governments and employers responded to the pandemic, with the governments changing their labor legislation, their labor protections, and employers going further than that, workers were being exposed to significant risks of modern slavery. But beyond that, also, they were being subjected to racial discrimination because in law and in practice, nationals of these countries were being provided with employment and other protections that were not being offered to non-nationals. And that was particularly true with low-wage workers. At the same time, the governments changed their labor legislations. This is in Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Qatar. They changed the legislation so that employers, it was easy for them to either fire workers or to put them on unpaid leave. Whilst those legislations talked about seeking the consent of the workforce, about limitations on that legislation, what our research indicated was that this effectively was just symbolism. It was basically providing a green light to employers to really just dispose of these workers who, in many cases, had worked for their companies and in those countries for several years. For many of these workers were actually basically living, this was their home, and they were forced to remain in very crowded accommodation to often actually get infected with coronavirus without getting adequate health care, or they were sent back home to their countries. And most of these workers that we documented were not provided with the wages and other benefits that were owed to them. But even that picture, which is a summary, doesn't really convey the human cost. And so what we tried to do with this research was to also talk about the psychosocial impact on these workers and a little bit about the impact on their relatives, their dependents. And so, like I said earlier, what really comes out of that is that this is a humanitarian catastrophe. And of course, the whole world has struggled with coronavirus. It's not been an easy time for anyone. Even in the best situation, if these governments had not changed their laws that violated their human rights and labor rights obligations under international law, government regulators would have struggled in some respects with dealing with the financial and the social impacts of the pandemic. But what we see is that businesses, and particularly businesses that were often given financial support by their governments, they actually really went out of their way to neglect workers, to actually take that situation that arose last year as an opportunity to actually treat workers even worse. Workers were desperate, and many workers, in fact, interestingly, even when they were in a very difficult situation, refused to leave to go back home, remained in overcrowded accommodation, because there was a hope that if they remained, hopefully at some point they would go back to work. And so, in this period after a report came out in November last year, and the pandemic conditions, the risks remain, but the situation has changed a little bit. What we see is that many workers, including those that we interviewed, have simply either gone back to work or have moved on with their life because really they can't afford to bring a case, practically speaking, or even legally, because for them, the risk of waiting for justice and the risk of ramifications or reprisal for daring to challenge what their employer or powerful actors have done to them would have severe consequences for them. And of course, that's something that we didn't really get to go into more detail in our report. But that really evidences the fact that what we're dealing with the situation that we documented last year, isn't just a historical footnote. It's a reality for all these workers, their relatives, that remains to this day. And if we don't address these issues, then I think the impacts will be ones that will be felt by these workers, not just in the short term, but much more in the longer term as well. Many of the reforms that have taken place in the Gulf region, much of the awareness that has increased in the region and globally around the rights of migrant workers in the Gulf, the good work, could actually really be completely undermined if the fundamental violations, the terrible conditions that governments and businesses acquiesced to last year and this year, if those things are not remedied, then in fact those reforms will really count for very little. So very briefly, that's really what we were dealing with and what we reported. We were very lucky, and for me, having worked as a human rights researcher for a decent period of time now, it was a real privilege to work with my colleagues, themselves often low wage workers, really, often in very arduous situations, but making the effort to give these workers a voice. And I hope that that's really conveyed in the research that we did. That was one thing that really, for all of us, gave us a lot of strength. The fact that we as a team, as a group, had a lot of solidarity and felt that as challenging as these situations are, that it provides us with the sense that we're actually giving these people a voice. And that really was one of the key things that we wanted to achieve with this report. Not the only thing, but one of the key things, which is to say that we wanted to provide an evidence base for people like you in this audience today, that obviously these are things that you're probably not surprised to hear about, but at least we have now clear, concrete evidence of the types of issues that we're facing. And perhaps these issues are not unique to the Gulf. I'm sure many of you listening today will have experiences yourselves or people that you know in every part of the world where they're facing these kinds of situations. And we know that low wage workers and migrant workers are often the most marginalized, the least thought about when governments and businesses think about how they address the issues caused by the pandemic. So for us, that was really key. But another thing that was really key with the work that we did with this research was to really stress that there are solutions. Some of those solutions are long term, but even in the short term, there are solutions. And so we outlined those in detail in our report. And I'm happy to go into a bit of detail about that, particularly if people have questions about that. But again, in summary, what we were saying in our report was, firstly, if governments have put through very positive protections for employment benefits, for labor conditions, for other support during the pandemic, those that support should be applied in a non-discriminatory way. In other words, it should not matter what your nationality is, the color of your skin, your gender, your sexuality, or any other features of who you are, that you're a human being. Everyone should be treated the same. We also talked about the need to ensure that where the government itself has set up positive reforms, laws, policies, that those are actually implemented. That the state, even if it is overwhelmed with the gravity and the volume of the issue, it nevertheless prioritizes the situation for migrant workers, because particularly in the Gulf countries, we now talk about low wage workers and migrant workers as being essential workers, because we now recognize that they're actually essential not just to our economy, but to our entire society. Well, in the Gulf, that's particularly the case. In the Gulf, it's heavily reliant on these workers in literally every facet of the society. From the moment you are in someone's house, where domestic workers are raising children and looking after families, to the places where buildings are built, to places where uh, uh, schools, children are taught, then they're cleaned. Every facet of society requires these workers. And so, therefore, there's, of course, a moral and ethical obligation, we feel, for these states to deal with this situation that migrant workers face. There are international obligations on these states and responsibilities on businesses to respect the rights of migrant workers. But we'd also say pragmatically, it's really critical that these states do everything that they can to respect the rights of these workers, because in fact their societies are completely dependent on them. And we saw, in fact, although there wasn't much reporting of it in the Gulf, there were outbreaks of the pandemic because of a failure and a discriminatory approach to how these states dealt with coronavirus. So for us, it was really key to talk about the need to address the discrimination aspect in the way that these states and employers responded to the pandemic. The other thing that we talked about, which really came out in our research, was the fact that effectively being part of a trade union and collective action by workers is illegal in practically every form in practically every Gulf states, with some exceptions. That really not only led to obviously the violation of labor rights, which it is, but it also massively hindered workers being able to get their rights respected, as well as employers and the state from actually addressing the issues that workers face. We're talking about millions of workers, low wage workers, most of them. So the fact that these states do not allow trade unionism actually hinders the ability of the state to deal with these sorts of humanitarian crises and to meet its obligations. And so one thing we also talked about in our report was that we are calling for these Gulf states to allow migrant workers to join and form unions and to exercise their freedom of association and all the other rights that are either directly or indirectly linked to trade union participation. We also talked about the need for workers, if they so choose, to have a path to naturalization, to become citizens of these societies. Because, in fact, whilst many in the Gulf refer to these workers as guest workers or as temporary workers, they are actually part of the society. And although for so many workers, the zoning, the urban planning of these societies is deliberately done in a way to marginalize them physically, so that they're kept in these crowded camps, these densely concentrated camps far from the population centers of where nationals live. The reality is that they are part of the society. And in fact, we feel in the long term, along with ending discrimination, along with allowing trade unionism, allowing workers a path to becoming formally part of the society without any distinction, is really critical to respecting their rights. In the Gulf countries, we're seeing, just like globally, a shift away from the oil economy. It's not a sustainable source of revenue. It's not sustainable for the economy. It's certainly not sustainable for the environment. So we are going to be seeing over the next 10, 20, 30 years some very serious changes to how the Gulf societies and economies have to operate. And so that's why what we feel what we're talking about is both an ethical, legal, and as well as a practical requirement for these states to deal with the situations that they're facing. So I think that really gives you hopefully a good sort of summary of the findings of our work. As Equidem, a charity, a new charity, we'll be continuing with this work. We'll be continuing to monitor the situation for these workers in the Gulf. We have other work that we're doing on other parts of the world. And of course, we'll be doing more work on human trafficking specifically. It's not something that we directly talk about in this report, although it is something that's very much embedded in the situations that we documented. If there's perhaps one thing to really stress at the end of it is The cases that we documented, and we were very careful about this, they relate to workers in the biggest companies and the smallest. It, like I said earlier, related to workers in every industry. And of course, it also related to workers who were men, who were women from different nationalities, different situations. What we tried to do is, despite the commonalities, also emphasize the humanity, the inherent dignity, and the individual experience of every person that we interviewed. And that's why it's a very testimony rich report. When it came to editing the report, of course, I've written many reports. It's natural to have to cut down the size of your testimony in your reports, but we really felt for this one that these workers really deserved a voice. And so that's why we really made sure that we talked about as many different scenarios as possible. And I like to think that when you read the report, as much as it's harrowing and it talks about some of the most marginalized people in the world, I think it also reflects both the many different aspects of human society, different situations that people face that we have to think about. All of us who are concerned about the rights of women and men and society, but at the same time, it shows the commonality that the issues that everyone is facing, the aspirations that people have, and the demands that people make when they are, the victims of injustice, they're pretty much the same. And so whether you're listening to this in North America or in Europe, in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, anywhere in the world, I hope as well that what we've documented will resonate. And so again, thanks so much for having me speak to you. Really look forward to your questions. But certainly for our end, we will be continuing our work. And like I said, we want to not just talk about the challenges, but also what we feel are very much positive things that can happen to address these issues that we've documented.